Today I wanted to look at Derek Smith versus Brian Shaw. Of course this is just practice, and I think that Brian has pulled before this quite a bit, but this seems to be one of the first practices where he's actually putting in a decent amount of efforts. He doesn't seem to be at max effort yet, but he's getting a little bit closer. Most of the practices we've seen with Brian thus far have only been technique, and he's pretty much not trying at all. But once you actually start to put a little bit of pressure into a match, that's when your weaknesses and flaws tend to be exposed. So I thought this would be really interesting to take a look at. Now initially in the first couple pulls here, we just see Brian working on his technique, and you can see that he is intentionally working on a hook. He's trying to supinate, he's trying to start with his shoulder more forward. So he's not losing his pronation here, but he's intentionally starting in a hook. This is on the right arm, and we see the same thing on the left arm. Brian is opening up a little bit, but he's doing this intentionally, and he's keeping his supination on purpose. He's not losing his pronation. But this is the first pull where Brian actually seems to be putting some pressure in. We can see this because of Derek's face. Brian is starting with a very heavy amount of shoulder commitments, and he's rolling out, and he is getting pretty separated, but you can see that he's putting a pretty solid amount of pressure. If you're causing Derek Smith to have that kind of face when you're a pretty much new arm wrestler, to me, that's pretty impressive. Of course, Derek is still trying to coach him and everything, but it at least appears as though Brian is putting a pretty good amount of pressure. Now, one thing that Brian is doing here, you can see when he's starting, of course, this isn't exactly a fair start, but he's probably not worrying about that at the moment. I do think that his level of shoulder commitment looks really solid, but he does something that a lot of newer pullers do, and that is they start with really solid setup, they start with good shoulder commitment, everything looks great. And then as soon as they actually start pulling, they completely get rid of all the shoulder commitment they had just a second ago. And this is pretty much what Brian does. He ends up being in a pretty open position. This probably isn't the safest position because there's quite a bit of spiraling pressure being applied on that humerus because of this somewhere around 90-degree angle that Brian is pulling at. So I would actually prefer to see him pulling more here if he's going inside. Having that shoulder commitment, that shoulder to protect your humerus, is often a lot safer than pulling in a position like this. And another thing that we see happening is, of course, Brian is relying quite a bit on that bicep and his drag. So by the time he finishes, by the time he gets this pin, you can see that his arm has opened significantly, and of course, at this point, his shoulder commitment is totally gone. So this would normally be a position where Brian's opponent could find access to that bicep, because you protect your bicep with your shoulder commitment, and Brian has kind of left this lane open for someone to shoot past, to shoot forward, and commit their own shoulder. But of course, this is going to be something Brian will work on for the future. Pretty much everyone does this when they start out. They end up being very bicep heavy and very lat drag heavy, and they tend to have a really open arm angle instead of being super tight like Brian is starting here. So I'm sure that in the coming months, we're going to see that angle tighten up, and Brian is going to be better at moving around the table while keeping that angle tight, instead of feeling like he has to kind of fall away like we see him doing here. And next, we're going to look at Brian doing some top rolls. So it looks like Brian is going up against someone else who is newer to the sport as well. So this is interesting. And we see that Brian's hook obviously needs some work, but it does seem maybe a little bit more natural for him than the top roll does. When Brian is top rolling, it seems like he has to think about it a lot more, and you can almost see him wanting to come forward. He opens, going back. This looks pretty good, but then he wants to come back forward, and he actually wants to hook, or he wants to press. So you can also see him in the top roll doing what a lot of newer pullers do, where they have to just sit there and think the whole time about pulling backward. They want to come forward, they want to press, and that's what we see Brian doing right here. But they just have to maintain that back pressure and actively think about it. So it ends up being very, very robotic, but of course you would expect that. And I think that Brian has put more work into his hook than he has into his top roll. But all things considered, this does look really good. It looks like he's getting quite a bit of up pressure generated by rocking off of his elbow. He's kind of posting, kind of doing a low hand somewhere in the middle maybe, and it is looking good Once he takes the wrist though, it looks like he's kind of losing back pressure and he's not really sure what to do there. So this moment right here is where someone like Devin would tell him, don't worry about finishing the match, but just continue to regrip and improve your position and improve your efficiency, and then you can do whatever you want. You can bleed your opponent out, but you don't have to worry about pinning right off the bat, and you don't have to transition to a press or something immediately. We keep seeing Brian want to edge that right shoulder forward just a little bit. So probably not something he needs to do, but again, I'm being very picky. He's looking super great considering this is, I think, maybe some of the first top roll footage I've seen from Brian. He's looking very good. So let me know what you guys think about this, but I am very impressed overall. I don't know what Brian has been doing. I think sometimes just doing the arm wrestling lifts can really help you get some muscle memory for the sport, so maybe that's some of what's going on too. But if this really is Brian's first practice where he's putting anywhere near max effort, I'm super impressed by him, and I can't wait to see him continue to progress in the coming months.